Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Tom Sinclair. Welcome to That VidBlaster Guy. Boy, I am so excited to bring today's show to you because we've been working on this monster PC build, actually 2 PCs, for a client for the last 10, 12 days. And just can't wait to update you on that. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. Also, one of the things that sort of popped out of that build has been, if you follow the VidBlaster forum, oh, by the way, it's forum.vidblaster.com. You can go there and read all the posts about VidBlaster, all the things people have tried with VidBlaster, their successes, their failures, their challenges, the hardware they've tried to use, the other ancillary software they've used with it. There's just a wealth of good information. And it's kind of like, in some ways it's more like, I would say leisure reading, where you're going to read through and there's some stories there, and in the stories are going to be good information. It's not going to be just fact. There are people that talk about the projects that they're working on and the struggles that they're having with them, or the successes that they're having with their projects. And it all kind of surrounds VidBlaster. By the way, full disclosure here, I am a VidBlaster reseller. And so you can go to our website, thatvidblasterguy.com, and purchase VidBlaster or an upgrade to VidBlaster, or buy a support package if you bought VidBlaster from somebody else and you need support. So there's the commercial on that one. One of the things that's going on with VidBlaster right now is a feature request. That's a part of the forum where licensed users like me and maybe like you can go and request that a particular feature be included in VidBlaster. And the developer of VidBlaster, Mike Versteeg, uses the feature request portion of the forum as kind of a think tank, a way for him to hear from end users what things might be helpful for them as they use VidBlaster. Now, this is something that only licensed users can get access to, this particular section of the forum. So you have to own a license for VidBlaster to be able to use this section of the forum, the feature request section. Some past feature requests that have come into use in VidBlaster include the instant replay, the very first version of instant replay, the second version of instant replay, and then the current version of replay, which is the slow motion instant replay with playlist. And of course, that's the one that I think is the most exciting because it mimics what you might see on television. It's really cool. And I want to come back to that in just a minute because that's part of our PC build. Other parts of the feature requests have been things that are a little, I wouldn't say a little less specific, but maybe not quite so obvious, like optimizing VidBlaster for high definition video. That was a project that was accomplished, I guess started and finished in about 3 or 4 months. And actually it's really still ongoing, I think. But about maybe 24, 36 months ago, that was a big feature request to make VidBlaster more friendly with high definition video. And so, some modifications were made to the software to reduce the CPU cycles that were required to run VidBlaster in certain situations. And I want to touch on that in just a minute and tell you about our forays into high definition video. One other thing, this is kind of funny because I wanted to tell you just about feature requests. As it turns out, I'm telling you about feature requests that have come into fruition and are being used in VidBlaster now and are benefiting my current client that I'm working on a project for. And I keep saying, I'm going to get to it in just a minute. I'm going to get to it in just a minute. And I promise I will. But I want to finish talking about feature requests because that's one of the strengths of the VidBlaster family is the ability to go in and say, hey, what about this? This would help me. And what happens is frequently other people are out there saying, you know what? That's a really good idea. I wish I'd thought about that. I'm going to go onto the forum and I'm going to agree with them. So I'm going to give a +1 ranking to that and make a post. And that's how you agree with something. You go into the forum, again, you got to be a licensed user, and do a +1. And one of the things that, oh, hold on a second. Audio pops and skips. Oh, golly. Not sure what that is, guys. I'm watching the live feed of the chat room, folks. So if you're watching recorded, you don't have a clue what I'm talking about. It looks like we may be having some audio issues just on the live stream, though. We'll try to track those down when we take our break here at the end of the first segment. Back to feature request. I made a feature request this week. Actually, maybe it was over the weekend. Yeah, it was probably Saturday or Sunday, because of what I will be going on, what I'm doing with the current client. One of the requirements for the client is to be able to record 720p 30 frames a second video from up to 8 different cameras on one PC. Now, that's a pretty heavy duty requirement, and VidBlaster has featured on the website in its comparison table the fact that it does ISO recording. And so I thought, okay, this is great. Let's be able to do it. And as we got into it, what we realized is that it really was sort of a hardware-software limit on that. The hardware couldn't keep up with what the software was providing because there was a lot of compression going on, and that was using a lot of CPU cycles. It actually, you would think, oh, well, if you're recording video for 8 cameras, it's going to be the disks that are going to be and the throughput to the drives that'll be the bottleneck, but really it was the CPU usage in compressing that video. And so my feature request was to say, how about let's have a less compressed or maybe even uncompressed recording so it would take less CPU power, and we'll kind of balance the CPU power versus what the hard drives can accept in terms of data. And so actually version 2 of VidBlaster, the recorder that was used in version 2, had a option for saving AVI uncompressed. And it used a lot of disk space, but it was very light on CPU. And so the feature request I made kind of included that, that is one of the possibilities of going in and modifying the current recorder to have an uncompressed setting where you could use it like that. And I thought, well, you know what? If it kind of catches on that VidBlaster can be used as an ISO recorder, then maybe we need an ISO recorder module or an ISO recorder controller, kind of like the instant replay controller or the macro. It's not really a macro controller, but we do have the playout controller. And what about another controller, kind of like a super module in a sense? And this controller would have in it the ability to set the source for multiple recordings. And so you might have, in my case, cameras 1 through 8. And so you could go into this recorder controller and set up your 8 cameras and set up how you wanted the video recorded and set up the temporary destinations, that is the flock of hard drives that you had set aside, one for each camera in this case, and then hit one go button and have them all start simultaneously and stop simultaneously on a stop. I was able to create something similar to that using 8 recorder modules and the macro feature. And so in the macro, we had a macro that basically told recorder 1 to start, and then told recorder 2 to start, and recorder 3 to start, etc., all the way through to recorder 8. And then we had another macro that told recorders 1 through 8 to stop. And then we would save it manually and give the file name, give it a file name that meant something about that camera, with the location of the camera or something like that, so that it was easy to recognize what that file was later. But I'm thinking, wouldn't that be a really elegant solution to be able to press, to preset all of this in one module, so you're doing not a lot of menu work, but basically you're just identifying your camera sources. you probably would still have to have camera modules identified, but you would identify, whoops, excuse me, you would identify what those camera sources would be in this module, and then have the one-click ability to start it and stop it. Anyway, that's a couple of different ways of going after the ISO recording, and I posted that as a feature request, and really it got a lot of +1s. That was really interesting to see. I appreciate all the folks that came out in support of that, and it got a lot of discussion too, and different ways to accomplish the same thing, and why one way might be favored over another. You can go to the VidBlaster forum, forum.vidblaster.com, but and go to the feature request section, and you can check and see that feature request right there. And then if you want to +1 it, by all means go ahead, and if you got something to add that too. But that was sort of the that feature request came out of this current PC build. And if you missed last week's show where we identified the PC build, the build basically was 2 PCs, pretty much similar specs. And let me see if I can bring up some graphics here. They were based on the Intel i7 4930K processor that uses the LGA 2011 footprint, and that processor is a hex core processor, which means instead of having 4 cores like a quad core, it has 6 cores, so it has 50% more cores. And I think its turbo speed might be a tad higher than some of the quad cores. That particular processor we put on an ASUS Sabertooth X79 motherboard, full-size ATX motherboard, and through the ASUS BIOS, basically clicked one button, kind of an auto overclocking for dummies, perfect for me, and our one-click overclock took it from 3.4 gigahertz to 4.1.5 gigahertz, 4.15, as needed. So as the CPU was needed on things, it popped it right up. Basically, it took the multiplier from, not the multiplier, but what is it, the cycle rate or something. Boy, am I in the deep end of the pool and way over my head on this one. But it went from 100 to 125, and then the multiplier increased as it needed to. Suffice to say, it was an easy way to overclock that hex core, and it brought about a good boost of power, I thought. And then on that base, we put in, let's see, where is it? Right here. We'll get to the graphic. We added 2 of these Blackmagic Decklink Quad cards, and you see all those teeny little connectors there. There are 9 connectors. 4 of them are actually HD inputs, and 4 of them are HD outputs, and one of them is a signal control of some kind. I didn't use it, so I don't know about it. Sorry about that. Can't help you. If you're interested in the specs on this card, go to the Blackmagic website for sure, blackmagicdesign.com. And so we actually had 2 of those cards in there. They went in and they worked very smoothly, as let's put it this way, as smoothly as Blackmagic products will work. And sometimes they can be a little temperamental. The connectors on the cards are a modified SDI, sort of a mini SDI part called a DIN, DIN 1.0/2.3 or something like that. And so it's not a very common connector. It takes a little bit of searching to find that connector. Somebody in the chat room, Martin K, is saying that number 9 is the Genlock input. Well, that's cool. I wish VidBlaster had the ability to use Genlock. Hey, maybe that's a new feature request. Genlock makes sure that all your video inputs are in sync with each other. And I'm not going to go into that because I don't understand it. How about that? Just teasing on that one. I know a little bit about it, but not enough to explain it to anybody else. The two Blackmagic cards, we tested those by using a Canon HF100, which is a common camcorder with an HDMI output, and connected that through a Blackmagic HDMI to SDI converter, and then out of that converter into the ports one at a time on the card. It was really an interesting experience to work with, and again, we had two PCs, each PC having two quad cards, so we ended up working with 4 quad cards at the same time. And it was
interesting to see how that worked with VidBlaster. The VidBlaster camera module, camera 3 module, again, that's camera Roman numeral 3 as opposed to camera Roman numeral 1. The camera Roman numeral 3 module allowed us to select the port, the video input, and that was interesting in the way that was. You know, VidBlaster basically goes to the drivers and says, "Hey, tell us what you are." He goes to the video drivers and say, "Tell us what you are." And so the driver says, "I'm Decklink number 1." The next one says, "I'm Decklink number 2," and they go down that list. But they don't always respond in order. So sometimes some of the other ones respond. "I'm number 7." "Well, I'm number 3," and they get out of order. And of course, number 1, the way it happens, is not numbered. So you end up with what they call Decklink capture as number 1, and then Decklink capture number 2 is number 2. In our case also, in addition to the Decklink, we had a Blackmagic Intensity Pro card installed, and you can see what looks like a giant VGA port there on the left side, and then a couple of HDMI ports in the middle and on the end. And the HDMI ports are inputs and outputs, and the input is recognized as a Decklink capture as well. And so the way the PC recognized it, and the way VidBlaster hence recognized it, is that Decklink number 1 was the Intensity Pro card, and Decklink number 2 was port number 1 on quad card number 1. That probably more than you want to know, but it ends up being an interesting part of the story as we got the two Intensity Pros to talk to each other using the output module on one, with the output set to 720p 60 frames a second was one of the choices that we had in the Intensity Pro as an output. And then on the other side, we set up a camera module that had the same, we selected our Intensity Pro as the video source, and then set it up with the same frame rate and the same resolution. And then instantly we had video. I mean, obviously had an HDMI cable going from the output on one PC to the input on the other. The purpose of that in the design was with two PCs. One PC is sort of a streaming PC and a mixing PC, and then PC number 2 as an instant replay PC. We were going to pass the video from the instant replay PC to the main PC and use that process. One of the other features of the Blackmagic card is that it allows for a sort of I guess you would call it sort of a passive pass-through. So if I hook a camera up to the Blackmagic Quad, I can hook a cable up to the output of that same port, and we can get the same video out that we're sending in. So in this case, I can plug a camera into PC number 2, and then a cable into the same port output-wise, send that over to PC number 1, so we don't have to worry about splitting the video signal. So that was a good solution for that, and that card was a great choice for that in particular. In VidBlaster, we found out, and I've known this, and you know how you can kind of know something, but then later on you really know it.
that the Blackmagic cards don't always play nice. They don't always pass their settings through. And in VidBlaster, you can use a lot of shortcuts because VidBlaster allows you to do a lot of auto settings. Well, using the Blackmagic cards, we weren't able to do the auto settings. We really needed to be specific with what our frame rate was, what our resolution was, because it did not like the fact that we did auto. And so there was some trial and error in getting all that dialed in. The other thing that we noticed in VidBlaster was that sometimes the camera module, sometimes the camera would say that it was sending one particular frame rate, but VidBlaster had to be set for a different frame rate in order to pick that up. There was a Canon XA25 with an HD SDI output that would, through the right cable, plug into the quad. It would output 720p at 59.94 frames per second. But in VidBlaster, in order to accept that, what we realized was that 5994 was interlaced. And so we had to set VidBlaster to 2997 in order to get a signal that wasn't sort of a split screen with half the video here and another half of the video here. So that was kind of an interesting discovery as we went through that process. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you? I thought in this process that we would have trouble with, I know, this was an interesting thing, and I want to touch about this in a little bit more detail in the second segment. The Canon camera, the client had 4 of these XA25 cameras. They're about $2,500 US each. And as we got into it, we realized that the HD SDI output on the camera was pretty well fixed at 60 frames a second, 59.994 frames a second. And it even if the camera was put into progressive mode, it sent out 60 frames a second progressive. Well, 60 frames a second progressive is like 2 times as many as 30 frames a second progressive. Now, I know that sounds kind of like, Tom, you're just an idiot. Of course it is. But 60 frames a second interlaced, it will equate in data, and I'm sure folks will correct me in the chat room if I'm wrong, but 60 frames a second interlaced in data converts to about 30 frames a second progressive. So if you've got a 60 frame a second progressive feed, suddenly you've got twice as much data coming as if you have an interlaced feed. So what we got was, all of a sudden, the design specs of the PC were exceeded by the camera. And that was a surprise to me. I wasn't expecting that. Perhaps that was in our conversation with the client, and it didn't dawn on me the significance of that. The client didn't realize that the camera could not be set back to 30 frames a second progressive. And we also, in the camera, didn't have the opportunity to set it for 720i at 5997. So that meant 5994, 59.94 frames per second interlaced, which is relatively equivalent to 29.97 progressive. All this, if all this is Greek to you, Google a little bit about the difference between interlaced and progressive. It's a fascinating discussion, of which I understand about 10%, but it doesn't keep us from diving into the deep end on this kind of stuff. Suffice to say, as we went through this whole process, we realized that the ability for the hardware to accept this huge amount of data the hardware was overwhelmed. It was not designed to handle that amount of data. That may have been a little bit of the issue that we were faced with the high CPU use at the very beginning in the recorders. But here's the but in all of this. You knew there had to be a but coming. And this is a good but. But VidBlaster to the rescue. VidBlaster, my favorite live video production software, had a solution. And I don't understand how it works, but I don't understand how a car works perfectly either, but I drive one. I don't understand how a cell phone works, but I use one. VidBlaster has in it, in the Camera 3 module, a feature called, oh golly, I thought I wrote it down in my notes. Oh yeah, here it is. The frame rate multiplier. Frame rate multiplier. And one of the settings, well, there are 3 settings for the frame rate multiplier. Good old auto. Frame rate multiplier of 1, which means if you've got 60 frames coming in, you got 60 frames going out, you're 60 frames. And then a frame rate multiplier of 0.5. Wonderful. There was the solution right there. So the solution wasn't in the camera, it wasn't in the card, it wasn't in the Blackmagic card. The solution was in VidBlaster. That VidBlaster now was going to take this 60 frames per second feed of 720 video, and it was going to essentially pick up every other frame. And it was going to reduce 60 frames a second to 30 frames a second. And when we discovered that, and when we did that, we found out that all of a sudden the PC perked back up. It wasn't being overwhelmed with data. The PC was now receiving the intended, what I built the PC for was 70 frames a second. 70 frames a second. 720p, 30 frames a second. And then we started singing. That was really, really sweet. Now, we still have the need for the feature request for the uncompressed video. I think that'll help things go a little bit smoother with the saving of the video and the quality of the video if it's coming in uncompressed and the PC doesn't have to work as hard to compress it and save it. So I'm still +1 on that one and still hoping that that's the case. But this has provided some relief for both me and the client in putting all this stuff together. That was a really big find for us. So kudos to VidBlaster for having a solution already built in that fixed this, and we were sweating blood over this, not blood, but we were sweating big time over the camera. This really nice camera, beautiful output, well designed. I mean, it's Canon products, has good glass, and suddenly it was designed for recording video, but it was also designed for broadcast. I mean, that's why it had that HD SDI output on it, because it was now a dual function camera. Part of it was going to be recording, part of it was going to be broadcasting, but the broadcast part didn't have enough options for us to take advantage of what we thought we could take advantage of. It's one of those things where you read the specs and you see in the specs that it does 720p over here, and you see over here in the recording side that it'll record at 24 and 25 and 30 and 60, or 29.97 and 59.94. But that was recording, not the broadcasting specs. So anyway, it's nice to know the equipment, and it helps in the future. So if you are looking at an XA25, a Canon XA25, I'm not sure what the European equivalent it is. I know the model number is just a little different for the European version. But if you're looking at the Canon XA25, I think the XA25 is a modified version of the XA20. In fact, I've got a picture of it here. Let's pop it up there, and we can take a look. That's the XA25. You notice the mount on the top, that big kind of oblong part, not the microphone holder at the very top, but the oblong part below that is on the other side, has 2 XLR mic inputs. And so that would be the X25. The X20 would be the same camera, but it wouldn't have all that stuff, that handle and the part above it for the XLR inputs. And then in addition to the
XA25 and 20. I think there's an XA10, which is a little stripped down version. But it does beautiful video. The HD video came in very nicely on VidBlaster. VidBlaster, took it and added graphics to it. The instant replay, again, once we were dealing with the right amount of data, the instant replay worked beautifully. What we did find was that the design was that we were going to take the instant replay, the cameras for the instant replay, 720p, 30 frames a second, and we were going to send that to two hard drives, or excuse me, one camera, two cameras to one hard drive. That was it, 7,200 RPM hard drive, and that didn't work. Didn't take long for us to realize that was a bottleneck there. We debated different things and came up with a solution of, it sounds simple, but one camera to one hard drive at the spec of 720p, 30 frames a second. That worked okay. And again, it was one of those things where early on in this process, as we were testing, I was really fortunate that the client was able to visit and bring his equipment and test with me, and we could get all this stuff figured out while we were both sitting down next to each other, as opposed to trying to do this remotely once he's had the PC shipped to him. And so I really appreciate him driving down from Michigan to Alabama to pick up this PC. But once we realized the data difference between the 720p 60 frames and the 720p 30 frames, that solved a lot of problems right there. That and a bad HDMI cable gave us some heartburn. But if nothing else, those kinds of trials and tribulations force you to your knees and cause you to pray like you've never prayed before. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. Well, that's it for this segment of That VidBlaster Guy. That's kind of our VidBlaster success story of the week. And I'm Tom Sinclair, That VidBlaster Guy. If you are interested in a custom PC build, you don't feel comfortable doing it, or you want us to put our special touch on it, we're happy to do it. I'll tell you right up front, you can get it done cheaper at your local PC shop. There's no doubt about it. You can build it cheaper yourself. But if you don't want to have to worry about that, I'd be happy to talk to you. Just shoot me an email, tom@thatvidblasterguy.com, and we can talk about your needs and how to best meet them. And oh yeah, I thought I would. We had a little shot here before we parted company. This is Nick Davidson, our client, in the background at one of the PCs, and this is right before we packed it up, and he's headed back up to Michigan this morning. So stick around for segment 2. If you're watching us on YouTube, go back to that VidBlaster Guy channel and look for Streaming Idiots, because that's going to be coming up here in segment 2. And we'll be right back with segment 2 in probably in just a minute. Oops. Let's try that one again. Boy, that was not very polished, shall we say. Let's see if we can't make that one happen one more time.